You walk up to a quiet wooden house at the edge of a Japanese village. The roof curves. The timber is dark with age. And then you notice something that does not look right. The entire building is floating. There is a gap of empty air between the bottom of the floor and the soil, and the whole structure is balanced on a row of wooden posts and smooth stones. The house is not touching the ground. Now here is the part that should stop you. This country sits directly on top of the most violent earthquake zone on the planet. Thousands of tremors hit Japan every single year. So why on earth would anyone build their home perched on stilts, hovering above the very ground that shakes the hardest? It sounds like madness, but it is one of the most intelligent design decisions in the history of human building, and it solves 4 enormous problems at the same time. Let's investigate. To understand why a Japanese house floats, you first have to understand what it is actually escaping from. And the first enemy is something you cannot even see. Japan is wet, not rainy day wet, soaked. The islands sit in the path of warm ocean air that dumps moisture across the country for months at a time. There is an entire season for it, the Tsuyu, the rainy season, when the sky goes grey and the air turns so thick you can almost drink it. Summers are humid enough to leave a film of damp on every surface. And here is the problem with all of that water. Japanese houses were traditionally built almost entirely out of wood. Wood and constant moisture are mortal enemies. Damp wood rots, it grows mold, and it draws in insects that eat it from the inside out. Leave a wooden beam pressed flat against wet soil, and within a few years, it begins to crumble. So the ancient builders did something brilliant. They lifted the entire floor off the earth. By raising the building on posts, they created a layer of open air underneath the whole house. Wind could flow through that gap, drying the timber from below, carrying the moisture away before it could settle and rot the structure. The house could breathe. That simple pocket of air beneath your feet was the difference between a home that lasted a generation and a home that lasted for centuries. But ventilation was only the beginning, because the same rain that filled the air also fell on the ground in staggering amounts. When the storms came, water did not politely stay in the rivers. It pooled and flooded across the low ground, turning village paths into shallow streams. And when the great seasonal typhoons rolled in off the Pacific, the water arrived in walls. A house sitting flat on the soil would have water seeping under the door, soaking the floor, ruining everything inside. A raised house simply let the water pass underneath. The living space stayed dry and safe, while the flood ran through the empty gap below. The people inside could wait out the worst of it, lifted above the chaos. In a land this wet, raising your floor was not a luxury, it was survival. Now, you might be assuming this was always how the Japanese lived. It was not. To find where this idea came from, we have to travel back thousands of years to a time when the people of these islands did the exact opposite of building up. They built down. Long before the floating houses, there were the Jomon people, one of the oldest known cultures in Japan, going back many thousands of years. And the Jomon did not raise their homes off the ground. They sank them into it. Their houses were called pit dwellings. Builders would dig a shallow round pit into the earth, set wooden posts around the edge, and raise a thatched roof over the top, so that the floor of the home sat below the level of the surrounding ground. You climbed down into your house, not up. And honestly, it made sense for them. The earth held warmth through the cold months, so a half-buried home stayed snug in winter. But there was a price. Living inside a hole in the damp Japanese soil meant living with moisture seeping up through the floor, with darkness, and with everything that crawls through dirt. For a hunting and gathering people, it worked well enough. But the moment a new way of life arrived from across the sea, the pit dwelling was doomed. And that new way of life was rice. This is the turning point in our whole story. Roughly 2,000 years ago, during what historians call the Yayoi period, a revolutionary skill spread into Japan from the Asian mainland. Wet rice farming. Flooded paddy fields. For the first time, communities could grow a huge surplus of food, far more than they needed in a single season. And that created a brand new problem that no Japanese person had ever truly faced before. What do you do with all the extra? You have to store it. And rice, it turns out, is incredibly fragile in storage. If it gets damp, it spoils. If rats and insects find it, they devour it. A community's entire harvest, the food that would carry them through the winter, could be wiped out by moisture and vermin. Losing the granary meant losing everything. So the Yayoi farmers built a special kind of structure to protect their most precious resource. And this is where the floating house is truly born. They constructed raised granaries, sturdy wooden storehouses lifted high off the ground on thick posts, with the floor sitting well above the reach of ground damp and flooding. The grain inside stayed dry. The air circulating beneath kept rot away. These raised granaries were the most important buildings in the entire village because they held the difference between life and starvation. But the builders knew that flooding and damp were not the only threats to the rice. There was a smaller, hungrier enemy: rats. A determined rat will climb almost anything to reach a meal, and a wooden post leading straight up to a granary full of grain is basically an invitation. So the Yayoi engineers added one of the cleverest little details in all of ancient architecture. They are called Nezumi Geishi, which translates roughly to rat returners. Picture a wide, flat, round disc fitted around each post near the top, just below the floor of the granary. A rat could scurry up the post with ease, but the moment it reached that broad, overhanging disc, it could not get around it. There was nothing to grip. The rat was stopped cold and had no choice but to turn back. A simple wooden circle defeating thousands of years of rodent persistence. That is the kind of quiet genius hiding in these old buildings. Now, you might be wondering how we know all of this in such detail. And the answer comes from a remarkable place, uncovered almost by accident in the middle of a war. In 1943, workers in Shizuoka Prefecture were digging to build a wartime factory when they cut into the soil and found something extraordinary. Buried beneath the ground were the remains of an entire ancient Yayoi village. Today, it is known as the Toro site, and it became one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Japanese history. There, preserved in the earth, were the foundations of raised storehouses and homes from around 2,000 years ago, along with the wooden tools and the layout of the paddy fields. Walking through the reconstructed Toro site today, you can see those raised granaries standing on their posts exactly as they once did, the ancestors of every floating Japanese house that followed. The blueprint was set in wood 20 centuries ago. But here is where the story gets even more impressive, because raising a building solved the problems of water and pests. It did not, on its own, solve the deadliest threat of all: the ground itself. Japan lies along the edge of what geologists call the Ring of Fire, a vast horseshoe of crashing tectonic plates that circles the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the most seismically active places anywhere on Earth. The land trembles constantly. Major earthquakes have flattened cities and reshaped coastlines throughout the country's history. So you would think that builders here would want their homes anchored down as firmly and rigidly as possible, bolted to a solid foundation. But Japanese builders discovered the opposite truth. In an earthquake, the rigid structure is the one that breaks. Think about it like a tree in a storm. The stiff, brittle trunk snaps in a strong wind, while the flexible young tree bends and survives. Traditional Japanese architecture chose to bend. Instead of nailing everything into one unmovable block, the builders used an intricate system of interlocking wooden joints, beams slotted into beams, fitted together so that the whole frame could flex and shift and absorb the shaking rather than fight it. And crucially, many traditional buildings were not rigidly fixed to the ground at all. The wooden posts simply rested on top of large, smooth foundation stones. That detail sounds almost careless, but it is profound. When the earth lurched violently, the foundation stones could slide and shift slightly beneath the posts, and the flexible wooden frame above could sway and ride out the motion without tearing itself apart. The building was allowed to move. By not gripping the ground too tightly, the house survived the ground's fury. The very thing that looked like a weakness, a home that barely touches the earth, was actually its greatest defense. And nowhere is this earthquake genius more famous than in the Japanese pagoda. Look at a traditional 5-story pagoda. It is a tall, slender wooden tower, exactly the kind of structure you would expect to topple in a quake. And yet, across more than 1,000 years, almost none of them have ever collapsed from an earthquake. For centuries, people could not fully explain why. The secret lies in a single hidden element running down the core of the tower, a massive central pillar called the Shinbashira. The Shinbashira hangs down through the heart of the pagoda, and the individual floors are stacked loosely around it, each one able to shift independently. When an earthquake strikes, the floors sway in opposite directions, sliding back and forth, while that heavy central pillar acts almost like a pendulum, counterbalancing the motion and keeping the whole tower from shaking itself to pieces. It is a 1,000-year-old earthquake damping system, built entirely from wood, with no engineering manuals and no calculations. And it works so well that when modern Japanese engineers designed the Tokyo Skytree, one of the tallest towers in the world, they studied that ancient pagoda principle and built a modern version of the Shinbashira right into the center of it. A design idea from medieval temple builders living on inside a 21st century skyscraper. So far, everything we have talked about is practical: moisture, rats, floods, earthquakes. But the raised floor became something more than practical in Japan. It became sacred. At the spiritual heart of the country stands the Ise Grand Shrine, the most revered Shinto site in all of Japan. And if you look closely at its main buildings, you will recognize the shape immediately. The shrine is built in the form of an ancient raised granary, lifted on posts, with that same elevated floor the Yayoi farmers used to protect their rice. The most holy structure in the nation is, in essence, a divine storehouse. That is how deeply the raised building is woven into Japanese identity. But the truly astonishing part of ice is what the priests do to it. Every 20 years, for well over 1,300 years, the entire shrine has been torn down and rebuilt completely from scratch on an adjacent plot of land, using fresh timber and the exact same ancient techniques. Then, the old site is left empty, waiting for its turn again 20 years later. Generation after generation, carpenters pass down the precise knowledge of how to construct this raised sacred granary, so that a building thousands of years old in design is always, somehow, brand new. The form never touches the past, and it never quite touches the ground. It simply continues, renewed forever. Now, lifting the house off the earth did not only protect it, it quietly reshaped how Japanese people live, right down to their daily habits. And you have almost certainly heard of the most famous one. Because the floor sits above the ground, you cannot simply walk straight into a Japanese home from the muddy outside world. You step up into it. And that single step created one of the most recognizable customs in Japanese culture, the genkan. The genkan is the sunken entryway, a small lowered area just inside the front door, sitting at ground level, where you stop and remove your shoes before stepping up onto the raised wooden floor of the house itself. It is more than politeness. It is the physical boundary between the dirty outside and the clean inside, built directly into the architecture. The raised floor demanded it. The outside world, with all its mud and rain and dust, stays down at the entrance. The clean, dry living space stays lifted above it. Shoes off, step up, and you cross from one world into another. And that clean, elevated floor made another defining feature of Japanese life possible. Because the wooden floor was lifted and protected from the damp, it could be covered in soft woven mats made of rice straw, the tatami. You would never lay delicate straw mats directly on cold, wet ground, but on a dry, raised floor they were perfect. People sat on them, slept on them, and lived close to the floor in a way that only worked because that floor was kept clean, dry, and high above the mud. Take your shoes off at the genkan, walk in your socks across the tatami, roll out a futon at night, and the whole rhythm of living low to the ground traces back to the simple fact that the ground was kept at a distance. And the raised floor gave Japanese homes one more beautiful feature. Run a wooden walkway along the outer edge of the house, tucked beneath the overhanging eaves, and you create the engawa. a kind of veranda or porch that wraps around the building, halfway between inside and outside. Because the floor was already elevated, this open wooden corridor flowed naturally from the living space, a place to sit and look out over the garden, sheltered from the rain but open to the air. The Engawa is one of the most peaceful spaces in traditional Japanese design, and it exists only because the whole house was floating in the first place. Now, Japan was not entirely alone in this idea, and that is worth pausing on because it tells you the design was no accident. Across the warm, wet, monsoon-soaked lands of Southeast Asia, from Thailand and Vietnam to Indonesia and the Philippines, people built their homes the very same way, raised high on wooden stilts above the flooding rivers and the humid ground. Wherever rice farming and heavy rain met, humans independently arrived at the same answer: lift the house. That ancient raised granary the Yayoi brought to Japan was part of a much wider tradition that spread across the rice-growing world. But Japan took the idea and refined it for one extra threat almost none of those other regions faced so violently: the shaking earth. And that combination, the floating floor of the wet tropics married to the flexing, sliding frame of an earthquake country, is what makes the Japanese house its own unique creation. It is the meeting point of water and fire, solved in wood. So by now you might be thinking this is all ancient history. Beautiful old temples and farmhouses, but surely modern Japan has moved on to concrete slabs like everywhere else. And here is the final surprise: it has not, at least not entirely. Walk into a brand new Japanese house being built today, and in a great many of them, you will still find that same ancient idea quietly at work. Beneath the floorboards sits a ventilated crawl space, a deliberate gap between the living floor and the earth, with vents built into the foundation to let air flow through and carry away the moisture, exactly as it has for 2,000 years. The materials have changed, the reasons have not. The climate is still humid. The rain still falls, the ground still shakes, so the floor still floats. You will still step up into the home. You will still take off your shoes at the genkan. The deepest logic of the Yayoi granary is still living inside the modern Japanese house. And really, that is the quiet lesson hidden in this whole story. Japanese architecture never tried to conquer nature or wall itself off from it. It learned to live alongside the damp and the rain and the trembling earth, to bend instead of break, to breathe instead of seal shut, to rise gently above the ground rather than fight it. That floating house is not running from the world around it. It is dancing with it. So the next time you see a Japanese home perched on its posts, with that small, shadowed gap of air running underneath, you will know it is not an accident, and it is not decoration. It is 2,000 years of hard-won wisdom, holding an entire way of life just slightly above the earth. If you found yourself fascinated by the clever thinking buried inside these everyday designs, you are going to love what we break down next. The video on your screen right now uncovers another piece of history hiding in plain sight. Go ahead and click it. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, and we will see you in the next investigation.